Hello, folks. Good to be with you, and God bless you, and love to everybody out there. This is the GG podcast on Samuel's Weema channel, Africa Without Borders. Please keep me and my wife in prayer, and may God bless you all. I was struck this evening of seeing this video by Paul Williams, so I think we will go into um, the video a little bit.
Images. Isaiah chapter 53 is a prophecy of a coming
Paul Williams is a Muslim apologist, and he's talking about Isaiah 53, and he's attacking Christianity. So,
Christ, or the Messiah, being chastened, put to death, resurrected, and the reasons for it. Very clear. Isaiah 53 is another one. Messiah revealed through the holy prophets.
so he's showing that the Christians believe that Isaiah 53 is a prophecy. So he then shows us this book here.
Is the distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, United States, one of the leading biblical scholars in America. This text is published by Oxford University Press. It's a standard undergraduate text, and this book is used on undergraduate courses teaching the Bible all over the English-speaking world, and it's highly respected. Oxford University Press indeed publish it, which they wouldn't do unless it was extremely good quality stuff. So what does this undergraduate text say about Isaiah 53? And I'm just going to share what he says. And remember, this is mainstream scholarship. It's not meant to attack the Bible or cause doubt or skepticism. It's simply looking at it historically and in terms of its own context. And this, it turns out, makes all the difference in the world to what we read. And what I'm going to share with you, if you're not familiar with it, can be quite shocking and quite disturbing, actually, if one is a Christian who is not.
Right. First of all, he's talking about Isaiah 53. Bart Ehrman's not an Old Testament scholar. He's not a Hebrew scholar. And just because it's a book published by Oxford University, and just because it's accepted as a book around the world, critical scholarship, so called, have various theories, and these theories change from year to year, generation to generation. So when he calls it critical scholarship, it's not objective scholarship. These are theories, and they change from year to year, and they have various philosophies behind those theories. So it's a bit disingenuous to give the idea that this is objective scholarship, and just because it's accepted in the academic world does not mean that it's slam dunk objective and stands the test of time. Because very often these books are out of date after a few years.
Familiar with what Christian scholarship and Jewish scholarship. So the suffering servant. No passage of Isaiah has intrigued readers and interpreters, especially among Christians, writes Bart Ehrman, more than the four passages that are dedicated to describing a figure known as are Isaiah 42, verses 1 to 4, Isaiah 49, verses 1 to 6 of the book, possibly composed earlier by the author himself, and were then incorporated into the book in four places. We're not going to go there. That's not of interest to us today. In these passages.
Well, it is an interest because what he's mentioning there, he's mentioning that the scholars, the so-called critical scholars, believe there was editing going on, and bits were put in here and bits were put in there. Maybe it was put in by Isaiah, maybe it was put in by other people, and that's the problem with critical so-called scholarship. They have had a long history of not taking books as a whole. It's only recently, only the last 20 years, that scholars have started to. There's been a move to take books as a whole, and look at a book as a whole. Instead, what the critical scholars do, they chop up a book in little pieces and say, this is not of the author, this is not of the author, this was put in here, this was put in there. They never really actually get to grips with the book. So Paul Williams is not aware of this, and he's given them a false impression of so-called critical scholarship.
So these are the 4 servant songs. The servant of Yahweh is said to have suffered horribly for the sake of others, but God will vindicate him. He, in fact, is the delight of Yahweh and will be used by him to accomplish his will on earth.
I love Monday.com.
What's Monday.com?
You don't know Monday.com? This is Monday.com.
Isaiah 42 says, I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth. Isaiah 42, verses 1 to 4. Beautiful, beautiful prophecy there, apparently. The author believes that this unnamed servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up. That's Isaiah 52, verse 13. But the most important, impressive, and well-known comments about the servant involve his horrible sufferings for the sake of others. These comments have been highly important since the times of the New Testament, because Christian readers have widely thought that Isaiah was describing the crucifixion of Jesus for the sins of the world. And then he actually quotes Isaiah 53, a couple of verses. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering, acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our sicknesses, and yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. End quote. That's Isaiah 53, verses 3 to 6. So clearly Christians believe this is a prophecy
So let's see what the critical scholars have got to say
about Jesus, who is to come in the future, the Messiah himself. Bart Ehrman says, the author goes on to say that the servant was silent before his oppressor.
Just say about and he's not a scholar in the Old Testament. He's not a scholar of Hebrew.
That he was cut off from the land of the living, that he made his tomb with the rich, and that it was, quote, the will of the Lord to crush him with pain, end quote. Doesn't this sound, says Bart Ehrman, exactly like Jesus? Isn't this a prophecy about what would happen to the Messiah? It's so obvious, isn't it? Christians have said this to me many times. It's so obviously about Jesus. How can you not think it's about Jesus? It's so obvious. So, and this is where it gets interesting. In response to that common Christian interpretation, several points are important to make. And this is the heart of this video. It gives us pause, food for thought, and a different way of viewing these verses.
Just to note, he's using so-called critical scholarship on the Bible, but he would never ever use that critical scholarship on the Quran. It would be haram. It would be no way, Jose. You must never ever use critical scholarship on the Quran. So here we have this disingenuousness by this Muslim apologist. Always come in with critical scholarship, so called. These many critical scholars don't believe in inerrancy or inspiration of the Bible. They are many of them are neo-Marxist or influenced by existentialism. Um, they're influenced by various philosophies. These are the critical scholars he's talking about. He would never, ever, ever apply critical scholarship to the Quran, and yet he wants to apply it to Isaiah 53. So this is the dishonesty, this disingenuousness of Paul Williams as an apologist, and he lacks consistency in his methodology.
Verses from an historical critical. It's called the historical critical method. It's a way of approaching the text.
The historical critical method. Remember, he would never use that on the Quran. That's how dishonest he is.
That pays very close attention to what he actually says.
No, it doesn't, because historical critical scholarship has had a long history of chopping up bits of the Bible and not looking at books as a whole. And there's been a movement by some scholars to redress that balance, to say, look, we need to stop chopping the Bible up and actually look at it in its overall context. So critical scholarship, the type he is advocating here, has a long history of cutting the Bible up into little pieces and not looking at the Bible in as a whole,
Remarkable, isn't it? Anyway,
or books as a whole.
one. This is the points he wants to make. Now, point number one: it is to be remembered that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were not predicting things that were to happen hundreds of years in advance. They were speaking to their own contexts and delivering a message for their own people to hear about their own immediate futures. This is a really important point about the prophets in general. They weren't speaking of events in thousands of years' time. They were speaking of things.
Well, a couple of issues here. One is naturalism has come in there. Naturalism, by definition, doesn't believe any supernatural events. So naturalism will come along and not even think of the possibility of prophecy. So when Bart Ehrman says that it's about the time of Isaiah, some of that reason is because of naturalism, that he doesn't believe in miracles. And so he can't even contemplate the possibility of a prophecy, because that would be a miraculous event. Secondly, the nature of prophecy very often can have a double meaning. You could call it the two mountains meaning. I would call it the two mountains. You have a little mountain and a big mountain. So you see the small mountain, and then it over the horizon there's a big mountain. Very often prophecies would have a meaning for the times, but it would also dovetail into a meaning for the future. So very limited understanding of the nature of prophecy from Bart Ehrman and from Paul Williams.
That would happen in their own contexts, in their own time, usually. Important background information there. Number two, in this case,
still too lazy to learn AI? Watch others get ahead while you stay behind. Disappear for 1 month to become the most dangerous person.
The author is not predicting that someone will suffer in the future for other people's sins at all. What? How can this be the case? Many readers fail to consider the verb tenses in these passages. Verb tenses, interesting. They do not indicate.
Ooh, verb tenses. How interesting.
They, the verses, do not indicate that someone will come along at a later time and suffer in the future. They are talking about past suffering. The servant has already suffered, although he will be vindicated. And so this is not about a future suffering Messiah.
Because what? Because the verbs are past tense. Ooh. Read. Read that. Have a read of that. Let me read this to you. Hebrew, not a tense language. You heard him say, it's Isaiah 53 is about the past. The assumption that Isaiah 53 points to the past because it used the past tense is not linguistically correct. This is simply because the old Hebrew language didn't have a past tense. In fact, the biblical Hebrew is not a tense language. Therefore, what is considered past tense in English could either be past, present, and perfect present perfect or future perfect in the Old Hebrew. Modern grammarians consider the Old Hebrew an aspectual language. However, modern Hebrew does not have tenses. Biblical Hebrew verbs are conjugated according to completion, in completion, and in process. This means that the same form of a verb can be translated as either past, present, or future. The interpretation of the verse relies on the context and different grammatical signs. The most well-known grammatical sign is the vav consecutive. This makes an imperfect verb to point to the past. Without a doubt, Isaiah 53 points to the Messiah. It shows that in taking upon himself a human body, the Son of God became familiar with all pain. Isaiah 53 predicts the suffering of the Savior of mankind. This is especially true of verse 10, which says, "You make his soul an offering for sin." So putting the verbs in and saying it's of the past tense is a particular interpretation of Isaiah 53. That's what um, Bart Ehrman has failed to consider. Okay. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention is if you read the book of Isaiah, it does mention before Isaiah 53, it does mention that Israel is the servant. So you do have early on in the book of Isaiah and in the middle of Isaiah, it mentions that Israel is the servant. So another argument that can be put against the Christian position is, look, Israel is mentioned as the servant in Isaiah. So Isaiah 53 is about Israel because it's the servant which is mentioned in Isaiah as Israel in other chapters. However, if you do what is called narrative analogy analysis, what that means is if you do narrative analogy analysis, you will find that in the Bible, often later stories are told on the back of other stories. So, for example, the life of Abraham and what Abraham did is often a backdrop for other stories later on. Another example is Exodus. The Exodus story comes as a basic story behind many other stories in the Bible. So what that means is if you read about Israel as servants, you get four like major themes of what the servant is, which is mainly Israel. But when you get to the fourth section of the servant in Isaiah 52 verse 13 and Isaiah 53:12, we see a shift that the servant isn't Israel anymore. The servant is a person. So how do we account for that? And we account for that in terms of narrative and analogy. So what you find is in the Exodus story, for example, they come out of bondage and they go on to the promised land. And so what you find here, bear with me now, the section before Isaiah 52, verse 13, if you look at Isaiah 52, verse 10, so just come with me to Isaiah 52, verse 10, and this will give you a backdrop. Isaiah 52, verse 10. Isaiah 52, verse 10. It says, Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of all the earth. Yea, and go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isle, and lo, the inhabitants thereof. Right? So now Isaiah 52, verse 10, is a direct reference to Exodus 14:13. And what it's referring to is a new Exodus. So in the passage before Isaiah 42, it's talking about the old Exodus, okay? And in the old Exodus, there was a Moses. And so in Isaiah 42:10, it's now moving and shifting from the old Exodus into the new Exodus. And in the new Exodus, you have to have another Moses. So if you use a narrative analogy, it makes perfect sense that Isaiah 53 is about a person. Secondly, Jeremiah uses the same language in, let me just see, Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 18. In Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 18, if you check it out, verse 19, he uses the same language as Isaiah, but for a person. So using narrative analogy, using Jeremiah, also about the grammar that it's, if you're taking the past tense verbs, that's your particular spin. It doesn't have to be that way. And also noting that in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, and many other passages of the New Testament interpret Isaiah 53. It's a fair interpretation to say that this is a messianic passage about a person, a Messiah, without question. Now, when you look at the history of Judaism, the earliest Judaism also regarded Isaiah 53 as quite clearly as part of the Messiah, as about the Messiah. But who is the servant? One writer says, our ancient commentators with one accord noted that the context clearly speaks about the anointed one, the Messiah. Aramaic translations of this chapter ascribed to Rabbi Jonathan ben Uzziah, a disciple of Hillel, who lived early in the 2nd century, begins with simple and worthy words. He says, behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceeding strong, as the house of Israel looked to him through many days. So clearly, ancient Judaism regarded Isaiah 53 and interpreted it as a person, the Messiah. That's in the Targum Jonathan on Isaiah 53. We read the Babylonian Talmud. It says, the Messiah, what is his name? The rabbis say, the leprous one. Those of the house of Rabbi say, the sick one. And it is said, surely he has borne our sickness. That is Sanhedrin 98b. And there are multiple ancient Jewish sources of ancient rabbis that make a clear statement that Isaiah 53 is messianic, about a person. Midrash Rabbah, in explanation of Ruth 2:14, he says, he is speaking of the King Messiah, come hither, draw near to the throne, and dip thy morsel in vinegar. Again, the King Messiah. And I could go on and on and give you I could give you a long list and go on for ages. It's only in the Middle Ages when there was a particular Rabbi Rashi who wanted to counteract the Christians of the Middle Ages, said it was Israel, and he gave that interpretation. But you go beyond, way before the medieval times, and go to the early rabbinic sources. They saw Isaiah 53 predominantly as a person, and we've looked at a few bits of evidence by using number one, by using here's our basic argument now, and we're finished. Okay. So I'm going to give you some basic things now. Number one, in order to say that Isaiah 53 is not about the Messiah, Paul Williams, the Muslim apologist, has to come with so-called critical scholarship. Critical scholarship is well known for editing the Bible and coming up with sources behind the Bible, cutting up the Bible, and very rarely actually looks at a whole book in its context. Critical scholarship often comes with philosophical bias, and we're seeing that in terms of Bart Ehrman saying, and I quote, that the prophecy of Isaiah 53 was not a prophecy but was for that day. That is a naturalistic assumption that is influenced his interpretation. Secondly, we've seen that the argument about the verbs being past is not properly looking at the Hebrew. The Hebrew tenses are not as easily verifiable as they make out. Thirdly, by using narrative analogy or narrative analysis, in other words, recognizing that in the Old Testament, stories that are early on, such as Abraham and Exodus, are actually mimicked in future writings. So, for example, the Exodus, you have them in slavery, and then they come out and they go into the promised land. So when you take that story, Isaiah is actually using Exodus for a basis of what he's trying to say. And what I showed you is that there are four main references, chunks of scripture concerning who the servant is. Three of those chunks say that it is Israel. The fourth chunk of when it mentions servant is actually a person, the Messiah. And so when anybody argues that the servant is Israel in Isaiah 53, it fails to understand the narrative and analogy that Isaiah is using Exodus, which I proved to you by showing you unequivocally reference to Exodus in Isaiah 52, verse 10, which is a quote of Exodus 14:15. The significance of this is that what Isaiah is saying is, I've done the three chunks that the servant in Israel, but now we're moving into the new Exodus in the fourth section of the servant, which is now the Messiah, because in the new Exodus, we have to have a new Moses. And that is the point of Isaiah 52, verse 10. And because Bart Ehrman and Paul Williams have not done narrative analysis or narrative analogy, they have failed to see the significance of this pattern within the book of Isaiah. And then, fourthly, I mentioned Jeremiah also quotes Isaiah 53. I mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 18 to 19, he quotes Isaiah 53 and applies it to a person. And finally, the New Testament writers, and I just give one example, there could be many, also mention Isaiah 53 as the Messiah, mentioning the Messiah in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. And then finally, I gave categorical, solid evidence to show you way before Rashdi, who is the perpetrator of this teaching that the servant in Isaiah 53 is Israel. Way before the Middle Age interpretation, we have clear, solid evidence of many, and I could give you many ancient sources, rabbinic sources, that show that the rabbis saw Isaiah 53 as a person, about the Messiah. And we could go into more study on that, but I think I've given you enough reference to refute this Muslim apologist who is bandering about critical scholarship, so-called, but he would never apply it to his own position. He would never do that in a million years. He would never apply Bart Ehrman to the Quran. And by the way, Bart Ehrman is not an Old Testament scholar. And so why he's quoting him, I have no idea. So I'm going to let someone come on for a minute if anybody wants to come on. So I hope those arguments will help you to deal with people like this. I'll put a link there if anybody wants to come on just for a minute. If anybody wants to come on, you're free to come on just for a minute, and then I'm going to go. So if anybody wants to come on, feel free to come on. So we've refuted his video, The Shocking Truth About Isaiah 53, the most Christians don't know. We don't need to listen to the rest of what he's saying. Just the basis of what I've given you. And also read Christian commentators like John Gill. See what John Gill says, and he will give you some good information. John Gill, Adam Clark is another one. Albert Barnes is another one. So I'm giving people an opportunity if they want to come to. So if you want to come on, you're welcome to come on. If you want to come on, you can come on. I'll give you a few minutes. There's about 3 or 4 of you there who are online. If you want to come on, you can come on just for a minute. I'm not showing my face because I'm a little bit tired. So he's been refuted. I hope you've seen that I've refuted the guy. The guy's a pseudo scholar. The guy thinks he's a scholar, but he's a pseudo scholar and inconsistent. Will never apply the same critical methods that he is spouting. He would never apply them to the Quran. And that's the dishonesty of the Dawa people. Okay? He's just hoping to ride your lack of knowledge on these scholarly issues. So okay, I'm gonna go. God bless you, Sage. Thank you for your comments, bro. And so God bless you and take care. I like this comment. That's a great comment. Thank you. So you can support us there. and you can support us. Here as well, you can support us there. And, good night, bro. Take care, brother. Thank you for all your comments and your contribution. God bless you. Okay, take care now, and God bless you. Bye now. Bye.